Good afternoon and welcome to the SRTR educational webinar on waitlist metrics, understanding transplant rate, mortality rate, and the new waitlist survival worksheets. My name is John Snyder. I serve as the Director of Transplant Epidemiology here at the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients, and just would like to say a warm welcome to everybody listening in today. I always like to begin with the mission of the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients. We exist to provide advanced statistical and epidemiological analyses related to solid organ allocation and transplantation in support of the Department of Health and Human Services and its agents in their oversight of the National Organ Transplantation System. Here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, we are at the Hennepin Healthcare Research Institute, and we have a team of about 25 dedicated staff working every day to fulfill this mission of the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients. We do a number of these educational webinars throughout the year. Today's webinar, of course, is focused on the pre-transplant metrics, the pre-transplant evaluations that the Scientific Registry provides to the public and to the transplant programs themselves. I will start following this outline, the contractual obligations of the SRTR. Why is it that we are doing what we are doing? I will give some pretty detailed descriptions of both the transplant rate and the waitlist mortality rate, so you can see at a high level how those calculations are performed, give you some of the nuances of each of those calculations. Then I will touch on the new tools that we have available on the SRTR secure website for transplant programs to aid you with looking at subgroup analyses within your population, understanding in great detail how the calculations are performed. Those worksheets actually show you the exact calculations and how they're done. And then I'll just touch with something that's on the horizon. I always like to give people a heads up of things that are in the works, ways that we're looking to improve and enhance these metrics as we go forward. We will try to save some time at the end for a Q&A. I will say that the Q&A we do sort of text message style. You will see a Q&A window pane at the bottom right of your screen is where it should be. And you would just type in your questions there at any time during the webinar. I have a team here who is fielding those questions, compiling them. We will not answer them immediately in that text box, but we compile those, and then we will read off as many as we can get to at the end and try to address them. I will say if we don't have time to address each one of them, we will respond to you hopefully in the next today or tomorrow with a response to your question if we don't get to it. Before we get too far, I always like to understand who is actually listening in. So I am going to open a poll that you should see pop up on your screen, and would love it if you could just tell me as best you can. I understand there are oftentimes groups that are listening in, but as best you can, who you are. It helps us to understand who our audience is, who we have listening in. This will be open about 10 more seconds, so if you could go ahead and click there. I'm seeing the responses accumulate here. All right. Great. The results are compiling. It looks like the most popular answers were the transplant quality professional, transplant administrator categories. So we compile these statistics and help us understand again who's listening in. I'm going to have one more poll that I'll put up in a moment here. And this helps us just get a sense of how many people we have. Again, if you are just you would check just me here, but if you have a few folks with you, it's helpful for us to understand how many folks we're reaching with our educational tools. So this will open about another 15 seconds. This just helps us get a final tally so we can keep track and understand as we go if we're having success in reaching people. And while this is going, I will add that if you have any suggestions for future webinars, things that you would like us to touch on, feel free to email those to us at srtr@srtr.org. In fact, this webinar today was a result of a few requests that we received into that line saying it would be helpful to the community to review this. We did do waitlist educational material once before, but we're happy to touch on this again as we go forward. So thank you for participating in those polls. Looks like the majority of people are just listening by themselves, but also have a number of folks that are listening in a group as well. So thanks for that. Wanted to start with just reviewing why the SRTR is doing what we're doing. This actually comes from the OPTN final rule, and then that is translated into one of the tasks in the SRTR contract with HRSA. Specifically, we have task 391, which is that the SRTR contractor shall develop program-specific reports on the performance of transplant programs and OPOs. The contract stipulates that we shall disseminate for free over the Internet timely and accurate program-specific information on the performance of transplant programs according to 121.11b of the OPTN final rule. And the transplant program information shall include waitlist data, prescient to today's discussion, pre-transplant outcomes, acceptance and utilization of organs, and post-transplant outcomes. It also stipulates that we are to identify transplant programs and OPOs with better or worse outcomes. So we do that in a few ways that I'll show you in the reports. All righty. The contract goes on to stipulate specifically some materials about the pre-transplant waitlist outcomes. It says that we should include the probability of receiving a transplant, for example, the percent transplanted within a given time frame, which is in the reports. I'm not going to touch on some of those percentage calculations today as I'll focus on the transplant rate calculations. It goes on to say we should include dying or being removed from the wait list while awaiting transplant and other outcome measures such as overall survival from listing and the morbidity and functional impairment of transplant candidates if available. And so that last clause there is something we currently don't have in the reports per se, this morbidity and functional impairment, but it's a clause that, if the OPTN decides to collect this type of data in the future, that would be nice for the SRTR to include that in the reports as well. So let's start by focusing in on the transplant rate itself. And I have this nice little cartoon that helps me think about what are we talking about when we're talking about transplant rate. And I think of a queue of patients at your programs and how quickly are we getting them across this bridge into a successful transplanted state. So that's really what the transplant rate is trying to assess, is this rate of moving patients from your wait list onto a successful transplant. And so how do we do that? The basic calculation here is we're trying to determine how many transplants occurred, and then we're trying to divide that by the total waiting time at your program. So in the numerator, we have to pick a period of time, of course, that we are looking for these things to occur. So currently we have a 2-year evaluation period for the transplant rate, and this window of time advances 6 months every 6 months. We report these results twice yearly. January and July is the current release time frame. So we advance this 2-year window 6 months every 6 months, and I'll show you some examples here. And then in that denominator, we're doing the same thing here. We're actually tallying up the person years on the wait list during the evaluation window. And person years is a fancy term here to just a sense of how many people, and for each person, how much time they're contributing to that denominator. So it's not a person count. It's not a time count per se, but it's a person time count. And we convert that to person years, because I think person years is a more meaningful, it's easier for me to think in terms of years as opposed to months or days. You could do any calculation you wish, but we report on this as person years in our reports. So what I'll do is I'll walk you through a few examples of exactly how these calculations are performed. So what we do is we first define our 2-year window. So the current reports that are available on the SRTR site uses this 2-year window for the transplant rate calculation. And so we are essentially, imagine looking through a binocular or something at a specific window of time. We are focusing in on January 1 of 2017 all the way through to December 31st of 2018. And so we're going to be looking for patients on your wait list and any transplant events that are happening in that window. Okay, so specifically if a patient here, we have an example of patient A, we will call this person, who was on the list prior to the start of that window. And I don't have an exact date that person was listed, but just imagine this patient is on the list at the start of January 1, 2017. Anytime that patient was on the list before is represented by that dotted line there. We're just sort of ignoring that time at the start of that window there. And so this person comes into our window at the start there at January 1st of 2017. This person happened to be alive and still waiting at the end of the window. So at 12/31 of 2018, the patient was still alive and on the wait list and continued on, as represented by the dashed line after that. So the way we would do this calculation would be to say that this person contributed 730 days, okay? That 730 days is going to go into the denominator of the rate calculation, and I'll show you exactly how that happens. And this person would count as 0 transplants. This person was not transplanted in the window. So I'll show you a few examples like this, and you can see how the calculation will work at a high level here. So let's consider patient B, also listed prior to the start of the window. So again, we're going to start following this patient on 1/1 of 2017. This person, though, was removed from the list during the window. So I have here that this person was removed on October the 5th of 2018. And so this person is only going to contribute observation time, in other words, time at risk for being transplanted, for 643 days rather than the full 730 days. So this person was alive and at risk, if you will, of being transplanted and contributed 0 transplants because the person was not transplanted, the person was removed from the wait list, okay? So we'll keep those 2 patients in mind, and I'll go through 2 more examples as well. So here's person C, who was not listed prior to the start of the window, but indeed was added to the list during the window. So this person was added prior to the start of 2018, and was not transplanted in the window, was actually transplanted afterwards. We knew that a transplant occurred for this patient, but that transplant actually happened represented by the green person on your slide here. But it wasn't transplanted during the window. So this person contributed 396 days as they were on the list for just over a year in that window and 0 transplants, okay? So in the future, when we roll that person forward, that transplant will then count in the next cycle, right? So that's when that transplant itself would occur and be within our evaluation window. So patient D here is a person who was listed during the window and was transplanted during the window. So this person was listed on March the 1st of 2017, was transplanted on November the 15th of 2018. So this person, if you just do the math between those dates, contributed 625 days of waitlist time to the metric and 1 transplant event. So I've given you 4 examples of the different ways patients can interact with this observation window. And the way we would do this calculation is we're just going to add up how much person time do we observe. So here's our 4 patients, A, B, C, and D. They actually added up to a total of 2,394 days of waiting time that we observed. And only one of those patients was transplanted during the window. So we have 1 transplant event out of the 2,394 days observed, okay? Now, if you do the math on just those numbers, those raw numbers, you get this small decimal, 0.000418. And that is a rate, that is you could say that would be the rate of transplants occurring per person day at risk. And this is where I come back to that calculating these things at a daily rate level is hard for me to get my head around. It's hard for me to think about numbers that are small decimals like that. So we simply convert this to be, rather than a rate per person day, we convert this to a rate per 100 person years, which converts it to a scale that I think is more intuitive, at least for me it is. And so how do we do that? Rather than having this small decimal where we're going to say, oh, your program's transplant rate was 0.000418 transplants per person day of waiting, we're going to convert that to a rate per 100 person years. And we do that by multiplying that rate. First of all, we have to convert the days to 100 person years. So we're going to multiply by 100 and then multiply by 365.25 as the average number of days, accounting for that leap year every 4 years. And so if we do that, we're going to multiply 0.000418 times those two numbers, and we get 15.3. So the interpretation of 15.3 is that we have 15.3 transplants per 100 person years of waiting. Again, person years is a little bit of a hard construct to get your head around, but it's simply, you can interpret that as saying, if you had 100 people on your list, each for the full year, you would expect about 15 of them to be transplanted. Okay, that's that's one way you could think of that rate. It's a little bit more nuanced than that because, of course, not everybody's on the list for the full year, et cetera. But that's the nature of a rate. We're essentially saying out of some unit of time waiting, how many events are occurring, how many transplants are occurring. So at this program, we would summarize this by saying, for every 100 patients on your list that are there for a year's time, we'd expect 15 of them to be transplanted. So a few FAQs to run through, things that we are often asked about. So how do we handle inactive time? The rate calculation here does not make a distinction between whether your patient is active or inactive, and we get this question a lot. The subtlety here is the rate is trying to describe, for patients on your list, we don't know what their future experience is going to be. We don't know how many are going to be made inactive at certain points in time and be activated again at certain points in time. So the rate is meant to be describing, for patients on your list, what's likely to happen to them. And again, we don't know what happens in the future. So by not making a distinction between active and inactive time, we're giving patients a more realistic expectation about how quickly they may in the future receive their transplant. So that's why that denominator number, we're summing up time on the list, both inactive or active time. Second question we receive a lot is what happens if the discrepancy between the transplant and death date and the waitlist removal? This can happen if patients aren't removed on a day that they received the transplant, might be a day later. Essentially what we're doing is if we determine through other reporting sources in the OPTN or other sources that a patient has died or been transplanted prior to the day they were actually removed from the wait list, we truncate that wait list time to that actual transplant or death date. This can happen, for example, if patients are multiply listed and one transplant program transplants them and the other may not find out about it for a day or two or more. We would truncate that wait time as if the patient was transplanted back when we found out about it. Same is true for deaths as well. Third question, what do we do with multiply listed patients? That is to say, patients that are listed at more than one program. If a patient is listed at multiple programs, only the transplanting program is credited with the transplant, and the patient's follow-up time would be what we would call censored at the other programs on the date that they were transplanted at the transplanting program. Okay, a long way to say that the wait time counts at all of the programs that they are listed at, whether that's 2 or 3, and we're counting up the time on that program's wait list. If the patient is transplanted, obviously at only one of the programs they're listed at, the program that transplants them would get the credit for the transplant, while the patient's wait time would be truncated on that day at the other programs. Final question here that we'll address is what do we do with patients that are listed for multiple organs? Okay, if a candidate is simultaneously listed for more than one organ, the candidate is included in the transplant rate calculation for each of the organs. In other words, if you have a patient who's on the kidney list, is also on the liver list, the liver transplant rate calculation is going to count that patient as a liver candidate while they're on the wait list for a liver, and the same is true for the kidney program. So the kidney program is going to have that patient's wait time counted for them as a kidney candidate, and any transplant that occurs would be credited toward those programs as well. So hopefully those are clear. If you continue to have questions, feel free to drop those into the Q&A box or email us at any time, and we're happy to address more subtleties of these calculations. I want to show you where these actually appear in the program-specific reports. So these are the program-specific reports PDFs that you can retrieve from our public website at www.srtr.org. And if you open your programs report and navigate to table B4, I just have a snapshot of that table here on the screen. And so a few things I would point out. The data that we have for that transplant rate calculation is shown in these two numbers. So the 248 would be how many patients were transplanted at your program during that interval of time. And the 222.5 is actually a person years calculation. So remember the example I showed you, I was calculating it as person days, and then I converted it to person years. Here we've already converted it to a person year number, okay? And so we have 248 transplants out of 222.5 person years observed. And now to make this conversion to the actual transplant rate per 100 person years, we're simply multiplying that 248 times 100 and then dividing by the 222.5. And that gives you 111.5. That's going to be the transplant rate reported in the next page that I'll show you. This would say that this program, for every 100 patients on their list for a year, we would expect 111.5 to be transplanted. Okay, rates can be higher than 1, if you will. It's not like a percentage which is bounded from 0 to 100. So this is saying that if patients are transplanting at a high rate, it's not impossible to have a rate 111.5 out of 100 person years waiting. So again, this gets translated into the bottom figure on that same page, which I'll show you here. Right below that table, you would see these data in our current report. And right here is that 111.5. So that is exactly where that number is reported. And again, that calculation was from the table above, 248 times 100 divided by 222.5. And you will get the 111.5 transplants per 100 person years of waiting. Point out a few other things on this table that I'll talk about in a minute. Expected transplant rate. This is where we use our statistical models to predict what we think may have happened at your program if you were transplanting your patients at rates similar to the national experience. So we have models that take into account the characteristics of your patients, and we use those models to predict what we would expect would happen if you were a quote-unquote national average program in terms of your transplant rate. So right away you would see here that 111.5 is substantially higher than the 39.6 predicted, so we would conclude right away that this program is transplanting at a higher rate than our models would predict. We split those rates up into adult and pediatric transplant rates as well. If your program has both programs, you would see a split there, the adult and pediatric split. And then we convert this transplant rate ratio and present this as a bell-shaped curve here showing the likely location of your program's transplant rate ratio. In this case, this is somewhat like dividing the 111.5 divided by the 39.6 over on the left. It's the observed to expected ratio, if you will. And so in this case, we get 2.77 is our estimate for this program. And this, you can think of this as just saying, well, 2.77 is about 3, right? So this would say that this program is transplanting patients at a rate 3 times what we would expect. So this is a fast or has a high rate of transplant at this program. If the ratio was maybe, say, 0.5, that would say they're transplanting at half the rate that we would expect based on national experience. we do present two different variations of this transplant rate in the reports. One we would call just the transplant rate, I put this in parentheses here, the all-donor transplant rate. So for liver and kidney programs, we know we can be transplanted by a living donor or we can be transplanted by a deceased donor. And that presents special challenges for us in quantifying how quickly patients at a program get transplanted, particularly because patients that receive a living donor, there isn't a standardized requirement for when those patients need to be put on the deceased donor transplant wait list, although they do need to be listed before that transplant occurs. But there is no set sort of standard way of doing that. And so it's hard to know what at-risk time is when you have a person who eventually receives a living donor transplant. Although there's no real quote-unquote right answer to this problem, we solve this by just presenting both constructs. The top one, the transplant rate, considers both a living donor transplant and a deceased donor transplant to be a success, okay? And the denominator is calculated in the same way that I showed you before. I have a pro and con listed on each of these. I think the pro here is that this reflects the experience of all patients at the program, whether they have a living donor available or not. So it's more of a measure of, if your program is aggressive in living donation and you get those patients through to their living donor quickly, your transplant rate may look higher overall, okay? So it's not necessarily beholden to the allocation system and your donor availability in your area. The con here, I think, is that differences in the timing of listing these candidates that do have a known living donor can lead to higher or lower rates. In other words, the practice of the program in terms of when they put these patients on the list actually will matter, right? So the deceased donor transplant rate tries to overcome that and be more of a measure of if your patient does not have a living donor and will not have a living donor, what's a more accurate reflection of the time they may wait or how quickly the transplants will occur from a deceased donor. So I think the pro here is that this is truer to a candidate's experience if they don't have a living donor available. But it might not reflect the total experience of patients at your program because your program may be an aggressive living donor program. So both of those constructs, they're both right, they're both wrong, they're telling us different things, and I think that programs need to take in context both of those rates as they think about understanding how quickly they are transplanting patients. This metric, the transplant rate, is presented in the search results for your program under this column that we label getting a deceased donor transplant faster. And for this, we are sticking with the deceased donor only construct of the transplant rate. That actually went through a public comment period where we took suggestions from the transplant community about what would be the best thing to do there. And it was felt that the deceased donor transplant rate was a better construct to serve as the basis. And we're converting that transplant rate ratio into these tiers. And the methodology for doing that is detailed on our website. But we do use, of course, the search results are specific to adult or pediatric patients. So depending on what you're searching for, in this case I am showing results from an adult search, we would use the adult deceased donor only transplant rate for that evaluation. If you were searching for pediatric programs, that would flip to the pediatric evaluation there, just so you're aware where that's coming from within our reports. So I mentioned the risk adjustment models that we use to predict what we would expect. I'm not going to get into great detail about those today, but I wanted to point out where you can find those on the website. So if you go to our homepage and look under Reports and Tools, you will see risk adjustment models for the waiting list. And I'm going to walk you through what that tool will show you. If you select that, you will see this page. And here, the first thing you want to do is look on the left side here, and you would choose your organ that you're interested in, and then which outcome you're looking for the model for. So we have three sets here. We have the transplant rate, where the arrow is pointing here, the deceased donor only transplant rate, and the waitlist mortality rate, which I'll touch on next. Here I've chosen the deceased donor transplant rate, and then this tool gives you a number of things that I'll tell you about. The first tab you'll see is the Model Elements tab, which basically just walks you through what are we including in this model. This is just giving you a list of things and where they are generally found within the UNOS data collection system. And so here you see things like the candidate's age at the time of listing, the candidate's blood type, et cetera, on down the list. So you would see everything that we're accounting for. You'll notice there are no numbers on this table. It's just telling you what is in the model. The Model Coefficients tab is where we actually have the numbers. Okay, so this tab is really geared toward if you have a statistician or otherwise number-savvy person at your program, they can download this as a CSV file. They could use that to do their own calculations of this transplant rate. And so this is not only telling you what's in the model, but exactly how it's being modeled. So we have all of the coefficients there on that table. To help you understand how these things affect the transplant rate or the expected transplant rate, we have a tab for model element plots. And here you can choose any of the things in the model, and it will draw a little picture there for you of how the risk adjustment is working. And in this example, I'm showing candidate blood type, and I'm going to zoom in on that figure a bit. Here I've highlighted that second data point, which is the blood type AB candidate. And this is showing you a hazard ratio for being transplanted, in other words, a relative risk, if you will, of receiving a transplant. And in this case, you see the hazard ratio is 2.15. These are called relative risks because it's essentially relative to the other levels of blood type. So you would conclude from this, if you look at blood type A, which is about 1 on this figure, and same with O, relative to the 1.0 line, blood type AB patients are 2.15 times more likely to be transplanted than blood type A and blood type O. In other words, their transplant rate would be 2.15 times higher than blood type A and blood type O candidates. And then blood type B is somewhere in the middle. And you can hover over each of those. So when we model this, we're taking into account for each of your candidates what blood type they are, and then we're adjusting our expectation based on these numbers here. And so any element you would choose in that drop-down will draw you a little plot like this, so you can better understand what types of patients would I expect to have higher transplant rates for based on national experience, and what types of patients should have lower transplant rates based on national experience. We have a baseline hazard tab. I won't tell you much about this other than if you have a statistician trying to create these models, they would need that number, okay? I'll just leave it at that. They'll need that number to do the calculation, and they should know what that's for. If they don't, just have them email us, so we're happy to help with that. The additional info tab just tells you certain things that you might find helpful in understanding how the SRTR models certain components of these things. So for example here, how we handle multi-organ candidates, so MELD score, different data sources, and et cetera. There's lots of helpful information there. All right, let's touch on waitlist mortality rate. Very similar construct, so I'll probably move through this a bit quicker than the transplant rate. It's trying to answer the question, at what rate do waitlist candidates die following a transplant and prior to transplant? That last clause is important. We're looking at the mortality experience of patients on your list prior to receiving their transplant. So the construct here is very similar to the transplant rate. We're looking at the number of deaths divided by total waiting time, again during a 2-year evaluation window, and again person years following listing, and during the evaluation window. I do want to highlight, though, this following listing clause. Okay, for waitlist mortality, we do follow patients beyond removal from the waitlist, and I will describe in detail how we do that. Okay. So just keep that in mind. It's different than the transplant rate, where a patient that is removed from the waitlist is removed from the calculation as of that time. For waitlist mortality, we're looking at the mortality experience after listing for your patients, not necessarily while on the list. Okay, so it's an important distinction to make. So here's how we do that. We follow patients from the date of listing or the start of the evaluation window, whichever is later, until one of these things happen. They are transplanted, they die, they're transferred to another program. If they are removed for a reason of recovery, that transplant is no longer needed, we continue to observe the patient for another 60 days before we would censor that observation, and before we would stop following the patient. Otherwise, we would stop following the patient at the end of the evaluation window, and I'll give you a sense of how that works on the following slides. So patients are followed beyond removal for being too sick to transplant, and we look for deaths using sources either within the OPTN itself, the NTIS system, which is the Social Security Death Master File. CMS also has death sources available to the SRTR. And so we continue to follow patients beyond removal for too sick to observe if the death occurs. So just a few examples of how this works. This person was listed on December the 1st, and the symbol on the right is meant to indicate that the person did die, but the death occurred outside the window. So this person would contribute 396 days and 0 deaths. Patient B, listed during the window and died during the window before being transplanted. So this person was listed on March the 1st and died on November the 15th. Here we have 625 days and 1 death. Those are pretty straightforward examples. Let's look at a little more nuanced examples. Here's a person listed on May the 1st of 2017. Person was removed from the list on October the 1st, 2018 for being too sick. And remember, we follow indefinitely after removal for too sick. So this patient indeed died about a month and a half later on November the 15th. So we're going to count time all the way up to November the 15th. So this patient would contribute 564 days and 1 death. If that death had occurred after the December 31st window, the patient would contribute time all the way up to December 31st with no death. My last example in this case would be somebody that was listed before the window, so we start following them once they enter that window. This person was removed for recovery on December the 15th of 2017, and unfortunately died on September the 25th of 2018. However, remember, in the case of removal for recovery, we only observed for an additional 60 days, okay? So this would be a case where the patient survived that additional 60 days and was not relisted. If they were relisted, we would of course restart following that patient as well. But this death would not count in the mortality model because it occurred more than 60 days after that removal for a reason of recovery that transplant was no longer needed. And the assumption here is that that death may have been an event that was unrelated to the need for the transplant, perhaps. We can't say. If the center said that the patient recovered and transplant was no longer needed, we're just going to follow for the additional 60 days. So again, that calculation, we sum up that denominator, we sum up that numerator. We had 2 deaths in this case out of 1,994 days. And in the same fashion, we are going to convert that to a rate per person year. In this case, we get 36.6. And so we would describe this as for every 100 patients on your list, prior to being transplanted, 36.6 may be expected to die at that current rate. So in our reports, again, a very similar presentation to the transplant rate. In this example, we had 17 deaths in the window, 246.4 person years of observation. For a ratio there, if we multiply by 100 on the numerator, we get 6.9. And that is shown here in the following figure in the program-specific report, 6.9 deaths per 100 person years of waiting at this program. And we have an expected, and we split this by adult and pediatrics, and we convert the O to E to a estimated mortality rate ratio, in this case 0.86, which here is because that's lower than 1. If you just subtract 0.86 from 1, you get 0.14. And you can think of that as saying that the waitlist mortality rate at this program is 14% lower than what we would expect based on similar candidates at similar candidates nationally. Okay, so the full national experience of similar candidates to what you have at your program. And again, the adult and pediatric version of that rate ratio serves as the basis for this rating on the SRTR website. We have a survival on the waitlist tier valuation on the SRTR search results page. And so again, the adult and pediatric splits there are what serve as the basis for that. I will say that column appears in the search results for organs with the exception of kidney. Last year, the SRTR received feedback that the waitlist mortality experience of kidney candidates is not necessarily a meaningful metric in terms of putting it on the search results page here. So that column does not appear if you're searching for kidney programs, but it does appear for liver, for the thoracic programs, etc. And back to our risk adjustment models, we have models for waitlist mortality as well. And so again, you would go to that same tool that I showed you before, just be sure to choose waitlist mortality as the outcome you're looking at on these models here. The tabs and the structure of this tool on our website is exactly the same as the transplant rate models themselves. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the tools that we provide to the transplant programs to help think through the calculations for specifically your patients and allow you to do your own subgroup analyses, etc. I'll point out again, this provision is in the SRTR contract that we should continue to develop and provide tools for performance improvement by transplant programs and OPOs. Specific things are mentioned within that clause in the contract that we should try to put out the OPO yield calculator, for example, QSUM charts, which we have available for the transplant programs. That last sentence is highlighted there. In consultation with HRSA, the contractor shall develop QSUM charts for additional metrics to monitor outcomes and systems performance. We have recently added to our cadre of QSUM charts that are available on the site. And recently, we started providing expected survival workbooks, which I'm going to show you today, for pre-transplant metrics. So we're excited to share those with you as well. Hopefully, some of you have found them already and have found them useful. So what was the motivation behind this? We have historically provided Excel workbooks for transplant programs to perform their own analyses on the post-transplant outcome side. And so many of you are likely familiar with these. These are Excel-based workbooks that are available to download on the secure site, and they allow you to do subgroup analyses for your post-transplant survival cohorts, both patient and graft survival. And programs have told us over the past few years that these would be helpful on the pre-transplant side as well, both the transplant rate calculations and the waitlist mortality rate calculations. So we took this request to HRSA in November 2018. HRSA gave approval for the SRTR to begin work to develop these expected workbooks on the pre-transplant side. In June 2019, we released the pre-transplant expected workbooks for kidney, liver, lung, and heart on the secure site. And so these have been available for a few months. Hopefully some of you have found them. I'm going to walk through how they work. Just so you're aware, this is an image of our secure site. And once you log in to that's securesrtr.transplant.hrsa.gov, you should be able to find them under the Reports tab. So as long as you navigate to your reports, you should find these Excel-based files that I'll walk through. Here's an image of what that file looks like once you open that file. A number of tabs here, and I'll try to give you a high-level overview of what you'll find. There's a number of tabs within the Excel file itself. Each tab has different types of information that I will highlight. The Guide tab just gives you an overall view of what each of the tabs contains. So that's just sort of a table of contents, if you will, with brief descriptions of what's on each tab. And then I'll walk through some of these tabs here. The evaluation tabs summarize the pre-transplant metrics for all candidates and for certain types of subgroups. And just say right off the bat that these tabs change slightly for the different organs you're looking at. So if you're a person who has the heart program and the kidney program and the liver program, you may see different tabs here depending on the organ. So this one here is a kidney example that I'll be walking you through, but you may see different tabs in the other organs as well. So on the overall evaluations tab, this is just giving you the summary data for those three main types of metrics that I just described. So you see the overall transplant rate, the deceased donor only transplant rate, and the overall waitlist mortality rate. And you have 4 rows within each of those that describe how many candidates there were in the evaluation, the observed transplants that occurred, the expected transplants that occurred, and or deaths for each of those, and the overall transplant rate ratio. So this is your overall summary. This isn't showing you yet how the calculations happened, but is giving you the overall summary. Once you start to modify your sheets and play with them a bit, you would refer back here to see the effect of those changes. By age here just splits this up into different subcategories of age for each of those rates. In this example, we have age less than 40 candidates and candidates that are age 40 to 60, etc. So you'd see different splits of your evaluations based on age categories. In the kidney books here, we've got the ESRD time evaluation. So again, splitting it up by how many years of ESRD there were for the candidates on your list if you wanted to subset it out. Excuse me. So the calculations themselves are actually shown in the Excel file, which I think is a nice way to start to play with it and look and make sure you understand how these calculations are happening. If you just highlight a cell, you'll see up in the formula bar there how this calculation is being performed. Okay, so these are shrunken transplant rate ratios, and so you see in that formula at the top, there's a +2 and a +2. Many of you are probably familiar with this Bayesian application, both on the post-transplant side. A similar thing is happening here as well. When you look at the expected rate, there's a longer formula up in the formula bar. You might need to be a little bit more familiar with Excel to track down these formulas and understand what's happening, but I think the beauty of it is once you sort of learn how the pieces of this fit together, you'll be able to track this fairly easily, how this calculation is being performed. That's what it looks like, just zoomed in on it a bit. I'm not going to walk through each of these points, but it does tell you exactly what cells are being referred to in the workbook so that you can actually understand better how this calculation is happening. And really what's going on is there are tabs on the Excel file for your patient-level data. So here's a sort of blinded out example of, you notice I'm on the adult transplant rate tab. Right to the right of it, there's a pediatric transplant rate tab, so your pediatric evaluations would be there. So in this case, there's one row for each patient who's in your cohort, and lots of columns here, so you can see exactly what data we had for your patients. I'll highlight a few things here. This is the include this patient column. These are all ones when you open your workbook. And think of 1 as yes and 0 as no, or true, false kind of a thing here. Let's say you wanted to evaluate your transplant rate with certain patients excluded. You could simply change those 1s to 0s, and it would remove those patients from the calculation. You could blank out the cell, change it to false. I mean, a number of things actually work, but just think of it in terms of changing the 1s to 0s is like turning those patients off. That would be one way that you could do your own subgroup analyses if you wanted to see what the transplant rate ratio or the waitlist mortality ratio look like with or without certain patients. The expected here is the contribution of each patient given their characteristics at listing and how many follow-up days we observed. Okay, so this is saying, given the number of days we observed, which is the column just to the left, and the characteristics of this patient and our models that we're using, how many transplants did we expect to occur for this patient in that number of days? Okay, so this is each patient's individual contribution to the expected. Follow-up days, as I said, is in the column immediately to the left. So you notice that patient 1 was only followed for 186 days of the 730-day window, and the patient right below was followed the entire window. In other words, was on the list, still alive the entire 2 years, etc. And so you see down the line the number of days each patient contributed to your evaluation. The evaluation period is highlighted there, so you can always know what dates, what was the window of time we evaluated. And then we show certain key dates here. What date was the patient listed and what date did follow-up begin? So here you can understand, was the patient listed before the start of the window or after the start of the window? And when did we stop following the patient? So oftentimes that's going to be the end of the window on December 31st of 2018. But if the patient was removed from the list prior to that, that would be truncated back there a little bit. So that's a real high-level look at how those workbooks work. For on the horizon, I just want folks to be aware, where are we headed with this? You remember back to our contractual obligations, there was a clause there that said that HRSA is interested in the SRTR reporting a concept called survival from listing. And you can think of this as sort of an intent to treat evaluation. In other words, for patients listed at your program, what's their overall survival from that point forward, regardless of whether you were able to transplant them or not. That's what I mean by intent to treat. Whether you were able to transplant them or not, we're going to follow them from the time of their listing and just see what happens as we look forward. We have been actively developing this metric for over a year. Presented a number of iterations of this to our advisory committee. We are going to be releasing previews of this this coming January, okay? So we have sheets ready to go for what this looks like for your program. We have models that will be previewed at that time as well. And the expectation is that we would have an expected survival workbook for this as well, when they're ready, and targeting a release date of that type of a metric into the report itself in the July 2020 timeframe. So keep your eyes posted for that. I think that'll be a nice addition to the pre-transplant metrics that we currently have available. Just provides an overall summary of what the experience is for patients listed at your program. With that, I want to make sure we save some time for Q&A, and I have with me here a few people that I'll mention. Dr. Andrew Way is our principal biostatistician who's done much of the work that I've covered today, works on the pre-transplant metrics for our team, and actually created the expected survival workbooks that I showed you. So Dr. Way is here with me to help address questions. Also have Amy Ketterer who's our senior communications coordinator, who many of you have probably spoken with on the phone if you've contacted the SRTR. She's fantastic. And Mona Shatter is our marketing and communications manager, and they have been monitoring the Q&A and been summarizing, and I think we'll try to get to as many as we can.
Thanks, John, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I hope you found this very informational. We're going to go over a few questions. If we don't get to your question at this time, we will definitely get to you via email later. So without further ado, I better get to it. First question is about the transplant rate ratio. Why is the transplant rate ratio not exactly the transplant rate divided by expected transplant rate, at least in the example in your slides, where it says 111.5 divided by 39.6 equals 2.82, which is greater than 2.77 on the figure?
I can take a first crack at it. Remember in the expected survival workbook where I showed you the plus two, the observed to expected calculation as that's converted to the rate ratio, we're applying a Bayesian shrinkage factor here. And so, I can turn it over to Dr. Way for any more detailed explanation, but that's the reason that if you divide those two numbers, you're not going to get exactly the same number. You will get the rate ratio is going to be a number that moves toward 1. So if you were at, say, 3 in the raw calculation, once you do that plus 2 for the observed and expected number of transplants, then you would get the rate ratio that you see. So you cannot just divide the transplant rate and the expected transplant rate and get that rate ratio. That rate ratio is actually a calculation of the observed number of transplants plus 2 divided by the expected number of transplants plus 2.
The second question is about patient death. How are you notified of patient death after removal from waitlist?
Great question. We have other sources of information. Both OPTN continues to look for deaths beyond removal from the waitlist through various searches that they're doing. We search the Social Security Death Administration database as well, and CMS provides some deaths over to the OPTN as well. So those are the sources that we're continuing to look in. But the person asking the question is correct that there is not a mechanism once you've removed a patient from your list for the program to report that death. But those are the sources we're using to look for those deaths.
You mentioned that patients are removed from the list for being too sick are followed indefinitely. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so when I say indefinitely, maybe caveat that with within the window, right? So we're only looking within a 2-year window. So if your patient was removed for being too sick, sort of the assumption there is that this patient is likely to die. But because we do assess for deaths beyond removal from the list, we're actually going on to look for that death to see if it actually occurred before we would maybe penalize isn't the right word, but penalize you a death, okay? Some folks have suggested to us that the SRTR should just consider a removal for death as a death, that patient is very likely to die quickly or soon thereafter. But because we do have death sources beyond that removal, we just continue to look. But in the removal for a too sick case, we will look until the end of the window. There isn't this 60-day clause for removal for reasons that the patient was too well, okay? So if the patient is removed for being too well and transplant's no longer needed, then we would add another 60 days of observation before we would say, yes, the patient was likely too well and we're going to stop evaluating them.
And this question harkens back a little bit to our previous reporting style. Why did you drop the statistically significant comment from transplant rate?
Yeah, good question. That has been, back a number 5 years or so ago now when we converted to the Bayesian system. We have removed, as we've converted each of the metrics from the traditional statistical reporting approach, the frequentist approach where we attached p-values to these evaluations, we removed the p-values in favor of the Bayesian credible intervals. And you can think of those as sort of akin to a 95% confidence interval, but they're Bayesian credible intervals that are presented along with the transplant rate ratio. And so we felt that that's a better capture of the range of where that estimate is likely to be. So we removed the p-values in favor of the credible intervals that accompany those bell-shaped curves that I showed you.
All right, thank you. And we have time for one more question. And that is, what if a patient is removed for being too sick and does not die before the December 31st, 2018, but then dies in January 2019? Does their death count for the next period?
Yes, as long as there's observation window during that next period. When you shift it forward 6 months, if that death now occurs in the observation window of when that patient would be followed, yes, that would count in the next evaluation cycle. Was that all the questions, or did we'll get to?
That's it for today. I think we can go ahead and wrap it up for today. Thank you very much, John.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Again, if we didn't get questions answered, we will email those off to you in response to those. And as always, you can, I'll just flip here. Here's ways you can keep in touch with us. Twitter, LinkedIn, we have a YouTube channel that you can access directly from our site. We will post recordings of these webinars within a day or two following today's webinar, so you can always refer back to it. And questions are always welcome. SRTR@srtr.org is the best way to reach us. And we turf those questions off to the best person to get you answers as quickly as we can. So appreciate everybody's time today and wish you all a good day. Thank you.